Book 1, The Family, Section 1 of The Professor's House by Willa Cather. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Amy Dunkleberger. Book 1, The Family, Section 1. The moving was over and done. Professor St. Peter was alone in the dismantled house, where he had lived ever since his marriage, where he had worked out his career and brought up his 2 daughters. It was almost as ugly as it is possible for a house to be, square, 3 stories in height, painted the color of ashes, the front porch just too narrow for comfort, with a slanting floor and sagging steps. As he walked slowly about the empty, echoing rooms on that bright September morning, the professor regarded thoughtfully the needless inconveniences he had put up with for so long. The stairs that were too steep, the halls that were too cramped, the awkward oak mantels with thick round posts crowned by bumptious wooden balls over green tiled fireplaces. Certain wobbly stair treads, certain creaky boards in the upstairs hall had made him wince many times a day for 20-odd years, and they still creaked and wobbled. He had a deft hand with tools. He could easily have fixed them, but there were always so many things to fix, and there was not time enough to go round. He went into the kitchen, where he had carpentered under a succession of cooks, went up to the bathroom on the 2nd floor, where there was only a painted tin tub. The taps were so old that no plumber could ever screw them tight enough to stop the drip. The window could only be coaxed up and down by wriggling, and the doors of the linen closet didn't fit. He had sympathized with his daughter's dissatisfaction, though he could never quite agree with them that the bath should be the most attractive room in the house. He had spent the happiest years of his youth in a house at Versailles, where it distinctly was not, and he had known many charming people who had no bath at all. However, as his wife said, if your country has contributed one thing at least to civilization, why not have it? Many a night, after blowing out his study lamp, he had leaped into that tub, clad in his pajamas, to give it another coat of some one of the many paints that were advertised to behave like porcelain, and didn't. The professor in pajamas was not an unpleasant sight. For looks, the fewer clothes he had on, the better. Anything that clung to his body showed it to be built upon extremely good bones, with the slender hips and springy shoulders of a tireless swimmer. Though he was born on Lake Michigan, of mixed stock, Canadian-French on one side and American farmers on the other, St. Peter was commonly said to look like a Spaniard. That was possibly because he had been in Spain a good deal, and was an authority on certain phases of Spanish history. He had a long brown face, with an oval chin, over which he wore a closed, trimmed Van Dyke, like a tuft of shiny black fur. With his silky, very black hair, he had a tawny skin with gold lights in it, a hawk nose, and hawk-like eyes, brown and gold and green. They were set in ample cavities, with plenty of room to move about, under thick curly black eyebrows that turned up sharply at the outer ends, like military mustaches. His wicked-looking eyebrows made his students call him Mephistopheles, and there was no evading the searching eyes underneath them, eyes that in a flash could pick out a friend or an unusual stranger from a throng. They had lost none of their fire, though just now the man behind them was feeling a diminution of ardor. His daughter Kathleen, who had done several successful studies of him in watercolor, had once said, "The thing that really makes Papa handsome is the modeling of his head between the top of his ear and his crown. It is quite the best thing about him." That part of his head was high, polished, hard as bronze, and the close-growing black hair threw off a streak of light along the rounded ridge where the skull was fullest. The mold of his head on the side was so individual and definite, so far from casual, that it was more like a statue's head than a man's. From one of the dismantled windows the professor happened to look out into his back garden, and at that cheerful sight he went quickly downstairs and escaped from the dusty air and brutal light of the empty rooms. His walled-in garden had been the comfort of his life, and it was the one thing his neighbors held against him. He started to make it soon after the birth of his first daughter, when his wife began to be unreasonable about his spending so much time at the lake and on the tennis court. In this undertaking he got help and encouragement from his landlord, a retired German farmer, good-natured and lenient about everything but spending money. If the professor happened to have a new baby at home, or a faculty dinner, or an illness in the family, or any unusual expense, Appelhof cheerfully waited for the rent, but pay for repairs he would not. When it was a question of the garden, however, the old man sometimes stretched a point. He helped his tenant with seeds and slips and sound advice, and with his twisted old back. He even spent a little money to bear half the expense of the stucco wall. The professor had succeeded in making a French garden in Hamilton. There was not a blade of grass. It was a tidy half-acre of glistening gravel and glistening shrubs and bright flowers. There were trees, of course, a spreading horse-chestnut, a row of slender Lombardy poplars at the back along the white wall, and in the middle 2 symmetrical round-topped linden trees. Masses of greenbrier grew in the corners, the prickly stems interwoven and clipped until they were like great bushes. There was a bed for salad herbs. Salmon-pink geraniums dripped over the wall. The French marigolds and dahlias were just now at their best, such dahlias as no one else in Hamilton could grow. St. Peter had tended this bit of ground for over 20 years and had got the upper hand of it. In the spring, when homesickness for other lands and the fret of things unaccomplished awoke, he worked off his discontent here. In the long hot summers, when he could not go abroad, he stayed at home with his garden, sending his wife and daughters to Colorado to escape the humid prairie heat, so nourishing to wheat and corn, so exhausting to human beings. In those months, when he was a bachelor again, he brought down his books and papers and worked in a deck chair under the linden trees, breakfasted and lunched, and had his tea in the garden. And it was there he and Tom Outland used to sit and talk half through the warm, soft nights. On this September morning, however, St. Peter knew that he could not evade the unpleasant effects of change by tarrying among his autumn flowers. He must plunge in like a man and get used to the feeling that under his workroom there was a dead, empty house. He broke off a geranium blossom, and with it still in his hand, went resolutely up 2 flights of stairs to the 3rd floor, where, under the slope of the mansard roof, there was one room still furnished. That is, if it had ever been furnished. The low ceiling sloped down on 3 sides, the slant being interrupted on the east by a single square window, swinging outward on hinges and held ajar by a hook in the sill. This was the sole opening for light and air. Walls and ceiling alike were covered with a yellow paper, which had once been very ugly, but had faded into inoffensive neutrality. The matting on the floor was worn and scratchy. Against the wall stood an old walnut table with 1 leaf up, holding piles of orderly papers. Before it was a caned-backed office chair that turned on a screw. This dark den had, for many years, been the professor's study. Downstairs, off the back parlor, he had a show study, with roomy shelves where his library was housed, and a proper desk at which he wrote letters. But it was a sham. This was the place where he worked, and not he alone. For 3 weeks in the fall, and again 3 in the spring, he shared his cuddy with Augusta, the sewing woman, niece of his old landlord, a reliable, methodical spinster, a German Catholic, and very devout. Since Augusta finished her day's work at 5 o'clock, and the professor on weekdays worked here only at night, they did not elbow each other too much. Besides, neither was devoid of consideration. Every evening before she left, Augusta swept up the scraps from the floor, rolled her patterns, closed the sewing machine, and picked ravellings off the box couch so that there would be no threads to stick to the professor's old smoking jacket if he should happen to lie down for a moment in working hours. St. Peter, in his turn, when he put out his lamp after midnight, was careful to brush away ashes and tobacco crumbs. Smoking was very distasteful to Augusta, and to open the hinged window back as far as it would go, on the second hook, so that the night wind might carry away the smell of his pipe as much as possible. The unfinished dresses which she left hanging on the forms, however, were often so saturated with smoke that he knew she found it a trial to work on them next morning. These forms were the subject of much banter between them. The one which Augusta called the bust stood in the darkest corner of the room upon a high wooden chest in which blankets and winter wraps were yearly stored. It was a headless, armless female torso, covered with strong black cotton, and so richly developed in the part for which it was named that the professor once explained to Augusta how, in calling it so, she followed a natural law of language, termed for convenience metonymy. Augusta enjoyed the professor when he was risque, since she was sure of his ultimate delicacy, though this figure looked so ample and billowy, as if you might lay your head upon its deep-breathing softness and rest safe forever. If you touched it, you suffered a severe shock, no matter how many times you had touched it before. It presented the most unsympathetic surface imaginable. Its hardness was not that of wood, which responds to concussion with living vibration and is stimulating to the hand, nor that of felt, which drinks something from the fingers. It was a dead, opaque, lumpy solidity, like chunks of putty or tightly packed sawdust, very disappointing to the tactile sense, yet somehow always fooling you again. For no matter how often you had bumped up against that torso, you could never believe that contact with it would be as bad as it was. The second form was more self-revelatory, a full-length female figure in a smart wire skirt, with a trim metal waistline. It had no legs, as one could see all too well, no viscera behind its glistening ribs, and its bosom resembled a strong wire birdcage. But St. Peter contended that it had a nervous system. When Augusta left it clad for the night in a new party dress for Rosamond or Kathleen, it often took on a sprightly, tricky air, as if it were going out for the evening to make a great show of being harum-scarum, giddy, folle. It seemed just on the point of tripping downstairs or on tiptoe, waiting for the waltz to begin. At times the wire lady was most convincing in her pose as a woman of light behavior, but she never fooled St. Peter. He had his blind spots, but he had never been taken in by one of her kind. Augusta had somehow got it into her head that these forms were unsuitable companions for one engaged in scholarly pursuits, and she periodically apologized for their presence when she came to install herself and fulfill her time at the house. "Not at all, Augusta," the professor had often said. "If they were good enough for Monsieur Bergeret, they are certainly good enough for me." This morning, as St. Peter was sitting in his desk chair, looking musingly at the pile of papers before him, the door opened, and there stood Augusta herself. How astonishing that he had not heard her heavy, deliberate tread on the now uncarpeted stair. "Why, Professor St. Peter, I never thought of finding you here, or I'd have knocked. I guess we will have to do our moving together." St. Peter had risen. Augusta loved his manners, but he offered her the sewing-machine chair and resumed his seat. "Sit down, Augusta, and we'll talk it over. I'm not moving just yet, don't want to disturb all my papers. I'm staying on until I finish a piece of writing. I've seen your uncle about it. I'll work here and board at the new house. But this is confidential. If it were noised about, people might begin to say that Mrs. St. Peter and I had, how do they put it, parted? Separated?" Augusta dropped her eyes in an indulgent smile. I think people in your station would say separated. Exactly. A good scientific term, too. Well, we haven't, you know, but I'm going to ride on here for a while. Very well, sir, and I won't always be getting in your way now. In the new house you have a beautiful study downstairs, and I have a light, airy room on the 3rd floor. Where you won't smell smoke, eh? Oh, Professor, I never really minded. Augusta spoke with feeling. She rose and took up the black bust in her long arms. The professor also rose very quickly. What are you doing? She laughed. Oh, I'm not going to carry them through this street, Professor. The grocery boy is downstairs with his cart to wheel them over. Wheel them over? Why, yes, to the new house, Professor. I've come a week before my regular time to make curtains and hem linen for Mrs. St. Peter. I'll take everything over this morning except the sewing machine. That's too heavy for the cart, so the boy will come back for it with the delivery wagon. Would you just open the door for me, please? No, I won't. Not at all. You don't need her to make curtains. I can't have this room changed if I'm going to work here. He can take the sewing machine, yes, but put her back on the chest where she belongs, please. She does very well there. St. Peter had got to the door and stood with his back against it. Augusta rested her burden on the edge of the chest. But next week I'll be working on Mrs. St. Peter's clothes, and I'll need the forms. As the boy's here, he'll just wheel them over, she said soothingly. I'm damned if he will. They shan't be wheeled. They stay right there in their own place. You shan't take away my ladies. I never heard of such a thing. Augusta was vexed with him now, and a little ashamed of him. But, Professor, I can't work without my forms. They've been in your way all these years, and you've always complained of them, so don't be contrary, sir. I never complained, Augusta, perhaps of certain disappointments they recalled, or of cruel biological necessities they imply, but of them individually, never. Go and buy some new ones for... Remind me when it's All Souls' Day, or Ember Day, or Maundy Thursday, or anything. Augusta said she must be leaving. St. Peter heard her well-known tread as she descended the stairs. How much she reminded him of, to be sure. She had been most at the house in the days when his daughters were little girls and needed so many clean frocks. It was in those very years that he was beginning his great work, when the desire to do it and the difficulties attending such a project strove together in his mind like Macbeth's 2 spent swimmers, years when he had the courage to say to himself, I will do this dazzling, this beautiful, this utterly impossible thing. During the 15 years he had been working on his Spanish adventurers in North America, this room had been his center of operations. There had been delightful excursions and digressions, the 2 sabbatical years when he was in Spain studying records, 2 summers in the Southwest on the trail of his adventurers, another in Old Mexico, dashes to France to see his foster brothers. But the notes and the records and the ideas always came back to this room. It was here they were digested and sorted and woven into their proper place in his history. Fairly considered, the sewing-room was the most inconvenient study a man could possibly have, but it was the one place in the house where he could get isolation, insulation from the engaging drama of domestic life. No one was tramping over him, and only a vague sense, generally pleasant, of what went on below came up the narrow stairway. There were certainly no other advantages. The furnace heat did not reach the 3rd floor. There was no way to warm the sewing-room except by a rusty round gas stove with no flue, a stove which consumed gas imperfectly and contaminated the air. To remedy this, the window must be left open. Otherwise, with the ceiling so low, the air would speedily become unfit to breathe. If the stove were turned down and the window left open a little way, a sudden gust of wind would blow the wretched thing out altogether, and a deeply absorbed man might be asphyxiated before he knew it. The professor had found that the best method in winter was to turn the gas on full and keep the window wide on the hook. even if he had to put on a leather jacket over his working coat. By that arrangement he had somehow managed to get air enough to work by. He wondered now why he had never looked about for a better stove, a newer model, or why he had not at least painted this one flaky with rust. But he had been able to get on only by neglecting negative comforts. He was by no means an ascetic. He knew that he was terribly selfish about personal pleasures, fought for them. If a thing gave him delight, he got it if he sold his shirt for it. By doing without many so-called necessities, he had managed to have his luxuries. He might, for instance, have had a convenient electric drop light attached to the socket above his writing table. Preferably he wrote by a faithful kerosene lamp, which he filled and tended himself. But sometimes he found that the oil can in the closet was empty. Then, to get more, he would have had to go down through the house to the cellar, and on his way he would almost surely become interested in what the children were doing, or in what his wife was doing, or he would notice that the kitchen linoleum was breaking under the sink where the maid kicked it up, and he would stop to tack it down. On that perilous journey down through the human house he might lose his mood, his enthusiasm, even his temper. So when the lamp was empty, and that usually occurred when he was in the middle of a most important passage, he jammed an eye-shade on his forehead and worked by the glare of that tormenting pear-shaped bulb sticking out of the wall on a short curved neck just about 4 feet above his table. It was hard on eyes even as good as his, but once at his desk he didn't dare quit it. He had found that you can train the mind to be active at a fixed time, just as the stomach is trained to be hungry at certain hours of the day. If someone in the family happened to be sick, he didn't go to his study at all. 2 evenings of the week he spent with his wife and daughters, and one evening he and his wife went out to dinner, or to the theater, or a concert. That left him only 4. He had Saturdays and Sundays, of course, and on those 2 days he worked like a miner under a landslide. Augusta was not allowed to come on Saturday, though she was paid for that day. All the while that he was working so fiercely by night, he was earning his living during the day, carrying full university work and feeding himself out to hundreds of students in lectures and consultations. But that was another life. St. Peter had managed for years to live 2 lives, both of them very intense. He would willingly have cut down on his university work, would willingly have given his students chaff and sawdust. Many instructors had nothing else to give them and got on very well. But his misfortune was that he loved youth. He was weak to it. It kindled him. If there was one eager eye, one doubting, critical mind, one lively curiosity in a whole lecture-room full of commonplace boys and girls, he was its servant. That ardor could command him. It hadn't worn out with years, this responsiveness, any more than the magnetic currents wear out. It had nothing to do with time. But he had burned his candle at both ends to some purpose. He had got what he wanted. By many petty economies of purse, he had managed to be extravagant with not a cent in the world but his professor's salary. He didn't, of course, touch his wife's small income from her father. By eliminations and combinations so many and subtle that it now made his head ache to think of them, he had done full justice to his university lectures, and at the same time carried on an engrossing piece of creative work. A man can do anything if he wishes to enough, St. Peter believed. Desire is creation, is the magical element in that process. If there were an instrument by which to measure desire, one could foretell achievement. He had been able to measure it roughly just once in his student Tom Outland, and he had foretold. There was one fine thing about this room that had been the scene of so many defeats and triumphs. From the window he could see, far away, just on the horizon, a long blue hazy smear. Lake Michigan, the inland sea of his childhood. Whenever he was tired and dull, when the white pages before him remained blank or were full of scratched-out sentences. Then he left his desk, took the train to a little station 12 miles away, and spent a day on the lake with his sailboat, jumping out to swim, floating on his back alongside, then climbing into his boat again. When he remembered his childhood, he remembered blue water. There were certain human figures against it, of course: his practical, strong-willed Methodist mother, his gentle, weaned-away Catholic father, the old Canuck grandfather, various brothers and sisters. But the great fact in life, the always possible escape from dullness, was the lake. The sun rose out of it. The day began there. It was like an open door that nobody could shut. The land in all its dreariness could never close in on you. You had only to look at the lake, and you knew you would soon be free. It was the first thing one saw in the morning across the rugged cow pasture studded with shaggy pines, and it ran through the days like the weather, not a thing thought about, but a part of consciousness itself. When the ice chunks came in of a winter morning, crumbly and white, throwing off gold and rose-colored reflections from a copper-colored sun behind the gray clouds, he didn't observe the detail or know what it was that made him happy. But now, 40 years later, he could recall all its aspects perfectly. They had made pictures in him when he was unwilling and unconscious, when his eyes were merely open wide. When he was 8 years old, his parents sold the lakeside farm and dragged him and his brothers and sisters out to the wheatlands of central Kansas. St. Peter nearly died of it. Never could he forget the few moments on the train when that sudden, innocent blue across the sand dunes was dying forever from his sight. It was like sinking for the 3rd time. No later anguish, and he had had his share, went so deep or seemed so final. Even in his long, happy student years with the Thériault family in France, that stretch of blue water was the one thing he was homesick for. In the summer he used to go with the Thériault boys to Brittany or to the Languedoc coast, but his lake was itself as the Channel and the Mediterranean were themselves. No, he used to tell the boys who were always asking him about Le Michigan, it is altogether different. It is a sea, and yet is not salt. It is blue, but quite another blue. Yes, there are clouds and mists and seagulls, but I don't know. Il est toujours plus naïf. Afterward, when St. Peter was looking for a professorship, because he was very much in love and must marry at once, out of the several positions offered him, he took the one at Hamilton, not because it was the best, but because it seemed to him that any place near the lake was a place where one could live. The sight of it from his study window these many years had been of more assistance than all the convenient things he had done without would have been. Just in that corner, under Augustus' archaic forms, he had always meant to put the filing cabinets he had never spared the time or money to buy. They would have held all his notes and pamphlets and the spasmodic rough drafts of passages far ahead. But he had never got them, and now he really didn't need them. It would be like locking the stable after the horse is stolen. For the horse was gone. That was the thing he was feeling most just now. In spite of all he'd neglected, he had completed his Spanish Adventurers in 8 volumes, without filing cabinets or money or a decent study or a decent stove, and without encouragement, heaven knew. For all the interest the first 3 volumes awoke in the world, he might as well have dropped them into Lake Michigan. They had been timidly reviewed by other professors of history in technical and educational journals. Nobody saw that he was trying to do something quite different. They merely thought he was trying to do the usual thing and had not succeeded very well. They recommended to him the more even and genial style of John a Fiske. St. Peter hadn't, he could honestly say, cared a whoop. Not in those golden days. when the whole plan of his narrative was coming clearer and clearer all the time, when he could feel his hand growing easier with his material, when all the foolish conventions about that kind of writing were falling away, and his relation with his work was becoming every day more simple, natural, and happy, he cared as little as the Spanish adventurers themselves what Professor So-and-so thought about them. With the 4th volume he began to be aware that a few young men, scattered about the United States and England, were intensely interested in his experiment. With the 5th and 6th they began to express their interest in lectures and in print. The last 2 volumes brought him a certain international reputation and what were called rewards, among them the Oxford Prize for History, with its £5,000, which had built him the new house into which he did not want to move. "Gottfried," his wife had gravely said one day when she detected an ironical turn in some remark he made about the new house, "is there something you would rather have done with that money than to have built a house with it?" "Nothing, my dear, nothing. If with that check I could have bought back the fun I had writing my history, you'd never have got your house. But one couldn't get that for $20,000. The great pleasures don't come so cheap. There is nothing else, thank you." End of Book 1, The Family, Section 1.